thank you for being here. Maybe some of you have already seen the show, or if not, then perhaps planning to go see it afterwards. So with that in mind, I will keep my presentation maybe a little bit short. I'm not sure how it's working, Farah, whether there's discussion afterwards or people just go up for the opening and the breaks. We'll have a Q&A. Okay. Okay. So I wanted to take this opportunity to talk a little bit about what I do as someone who's obsessed with and invested in history, particularly left histories in Bangladesh, but also Asia, and then also interconnecting with various other places. Sometimes the connections are quite organic, sometimes they're a little bit forced in my projects. I also like to do the forcing. I was also reminded by Farah that I should also try to kind of connect the research interest with the exhibition upstairs. So the way I did it, because I always find it a little sort of deadening when you try to describe the work, because the work is there to be seen, not to be explained in a slideshow, is that while I'm talking about my obsessions, the images that are in the background are all from the exhibition. So that's how you'll get perhaps a connection between what I'm talking about and the works in question, except at the very end of the slides you'll see two works which are not in the exhibition. So here we go. The first work actually that's the image is up there is called The Year 1973 Created Many Problems for the Imperialists. So, I work as a historian, but I do not write books. I work in a space, the museum and gallery, where there seems to be a patience with open-ended, inconclusive stories about the grey areas or blind spots of our shared histories, especially in the periods immediately after the end of colonial rule, and particularly as it intersects with the sometimes competing movements of world communism and transnational Islamism. Talking about communism and Islamism as both overlapping and sometimes in competition helps think of some of the similarities between Turkey, Iran, and Bangladesh, indeed all countries with a Muslim majority, silent or otherwise. Those of us who grew up being told that our future was to be a red century found the years after 1979 and 1989 to be a system shock. 1989, of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union, 79, the Iranian Revolution, but also the arrival of neoliberalism in Europe and North America in the new forces of Thatcherism and Reaganism. Elsewhere, 1989 may be seen simply as the decline and collapse of one of the two empires. For us, it is something deeper. It is in the area of ideas where we suffered the largest defeat. Because in the end, faced with the choices of the politics of piety and an idea of workers of the world, in the Muslim part of the world at least, if not more, the latter ideas did not prevail. In considering the shape of the global socialist project of the last century, I have looked at attempts to rescue this project through storytelling from the wreckage of failure and blowback. The sympathetic writers usually assign responsibility for our failure to Joggo Biplab Ojogger Hate, which from Bengali translates to the right revolution in the wrong hands. The wrong hands argument is always based on two other concepts, what if and if only. If only Lenin lived longer, Trotsky survived exile, and what if Che spoke indigenous dialect. A few years back, I began reading Samuel Moyn's idea of global history, as well as Susan Buck-Morris's case study of Hegel and Haiti as a way to understand what exactly I was trying to do inside the museum. In Buck-Morris's example, Hegel's work on master-slave dialectic derives from the Haitian Revolution, even though Hegel never acknowledges this source. Viewed from an activist lens, or even a decolonizing one, we can argue there is no such thing as solely European history. That the rest of the world, and in particular the colonized world, but not only, enters and builds this history. Reverse the direction, and you can argue there is no purely Asian history either. And in this I find useful Chris Manjapra's book, Age of Entanglements, which shows not only how Germany and India worked together in the space of ideas and scholarship before the Second World War, but how both sides used each other. He uses the word leverage, he also uses the words crowbar for each other, both of them united with a common enemy, which is British colonialism. And what's significant about that book is it argues that India is not a helpless partner in this, but a very active, knowing participant, knowing what they can get from Germany against Britain and what they cannot get. Out of the ashes of the Second World War came a new global contract, which eventually became the US-Soviet Cold War. But for those of us working on some forms of global history, it is important to look outside binaries of American, Russian, and Chinese spheres of influence. Instead, we can look at transnational, explicitly third world solidarity movements that started in Bandung, Indonesia in the 1950s and found a new life in the non-aligned movement in Algeria and elsewhere. The non-aligned movement brings us back to this exhibition, since the work on view here, 2 Meetings and a Funeral, sketches a partial, highly polemic history of the 1973 non-aligned movement meeting in Algiers and its alter ego, or ideological opponent, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation in Pakistan. Non-alignment comes out of a newly realigned world after 1945, when European powers, including Britain and Germany, are eclipsed by the rise of the United States as a hegemonic force. At the same time, there is the rise of an assertive, transnational third world project. This is the project that gives energy to the high period of decolonization, as one after another country overthrows colonial masters and joins the United Nations, or Bandung, or Tricontinental Conference, Pan-Africanism, or the non-aligned movement. This is a period and movement that many of us have explored in a celebratory way, although I argue there's a lot to not celebrate also. Here our problems begin. Transnational third worldism was a big tent and took under its wing not only charismatic leaders, but also dictators, military juntas, and unsavory temporary alliances of convenience. Decolonization, racial and economic justice, and socialism were supposed to be the building blocks, but not everybody saw things in the same way. I find that the museum allows us to work with these histories in a very unresolved way. Was non-alignment a form of third world politics that should be celebrated, or did it deserve to pass away? My friends think both. I find myself in the middle, which is where these projects begin. Working it out in a film rather than an essay allows questions to remain open and unresolved, to end up with, I'm not sure and I want to keep looking. But in addition to the ambiguity of the story's end, as you can play with it in the museum, there is another reason history writing within these walls allows certain pleasures and pathways not available elsewhere. It is the option to use particularly elliptical and abstract forms to make parts of the story not legible to state censors, something I have dealt with within my work in Bangladesh and elsewhere. Especially those forces of the state that insist on correct history, the title of this exhibition. In 2008, I began the project My Mobile Weighs a Ton, a project about the recent history of Bangladesh's military junta, which had just survived student protests, and in 2008, the year of the exhibition, was still in power and still had their censors and their spies everywhere in the city. In this case, the text in the exhibition arrived in the form of handwritten notes, little stickers, or posters. The text was a code. It was only legible to certain people, and so the exhibition stayed open. In Bengali, there's a phrase often used to art exhibitions, which is "Apni ashole ki bolte chan," which translates to, but what do you really mean to say? And is usually quite challenging and irritated in its tone. I found that question to be useful because I find that when I can be somewhat opaque, I can reach part of the audience and yet evade the state censors for as long as possible, so that we have our own secret community within the gallery or museum space. On the surface then, this exhibition, My Mobile, these are the images from Dhaka, not from upstairs. In upstairs, they're presented in a different scale. On the surface, My Mobile attempted to launch a manifesto for blurry photographs. Partisans of high-definition aesthetics will be happy to know my manifesto failed in Bangladesh. In 2008, I had demanded that our photography community switch to mobile phone photos, or as I defined them back then, blurry, low DPI, poorly framed, no rule of thirds, no color depth, giving you quick access to make temporary provocations without planning, intention, or press card. But really, I wasn't talking about photography or mobile phones. I was talking about the form of government that was being proposed to us. As the last line of the same manifesto says, suddenly moving from photography to something else, some people want us to shut up and become a nation of shoppers, but we're not yet ready to become Singapore. Mind you, this was in 2008, when the most advanced phone with camera was the Palm Trio, which did deliver low-quality images. What I could not do with my manifesto, the iPhone and Instagram made irrelevant in a few years. In any case, if you think the exhibition is about mobile phones, then as we say in Bangla, line ta kharap ache. The line is bad. I should call you again. I have described works staged on a museum wall as pages of a history book. To make the illusion more literal, I have paired images with notes, sentences, paragraphs, or lines of text that are scattered on the wall like footnotes. In United Red Army, the text takes over the entire film screen. That's one of the films that's on view here. But this is not only as footnotes. Sometimes the text has a different function as well. It acts as intertitles in the style of silent films. This is the way it plays out in both United Red Army and the timeline. Live true life or die trying imagined a photographer's disappointment in seeing the relative size of two political rallies in Bangladesh. One of the Islamists after Jummah prayers, the size of which rally astonished and intimidated him. The other of his comrades among the student communists and the art school graduates. The size of the second rally was so small, it caused the photographer to employ some old tricks. Crouching down, zooming in, all to magnify the size of the crowd. All to project victory, even when the communists were in disarray in all the Muslim countries he knew of. In 1978, Michel Foucault was seduced by an Ayatollah's steely determination to discipline and punish. He wrote 13 essays in a year, endorsing the coming revolution. He wrote, "With respect to liberties, they will be respected to the extent that their exercise will not harm others. Minorities will be protected and free to live as they please on the condition that they do not harm the majority. Between men and women, there will not be inequality with respect to rights, but difference, since there is natural difference. With respect to politics, decisions should be made by the majority, the leaders should be responsible to the people, and each person, as it is laid out in the Quran, should be able to stand up and hold accountable he who governs." End quote. It was the photographer Gilles Perez who was not won over. Unlike Foucault, he calmly photographed and collated. Later, he excavated the telex, urgent messages from the Paris news agency, with even more requests. Please, more photos of black chador, women, communists. Please, more, now. The philosopher predicted the birth of ideas. The photographer saw things carried out in the name of revolution. Later, a collection of his lectures were translated and named "Society Must Be Defended." These days, I want to change it to "Solidarity Must Be Defended," because that spirit is also under attack. All through these cases of misrecognition, such that we don't believe solidarity anymore. We always think, would we make mistakes too? After all, we don't know the local situation or the language. But what about those people who are not afraid about transnational solidarity, even with all its risks? Like Foucault, Peter Custers did not think of revolution betrayed when he arrived in Bangladesh in 1973. Peter, like many European leftists of his generation, after reading Herbert Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man, believed that even if the alienated masses trapped inside modernity were numbed into obedience, the revolutionary spirit might still be found outside modernity, in the prisons and ghettos of the First World, or in the cities and villages of the Third. It was a search for the latter that led him to drop out of his PhD program at Johns Hopkins and move to Asia. As he found out, though, there was never a complete outside. A numbed proletariat could also doom leftist uprisings in the vaunted Third World. In Leiden, we met in the summer. It was Ramadan, and Peter asked if I was fasting. When I said no, he smiled and said, "Then we can have a Dutch treat, some Turkish bread." We walked into a store with a sign in Dutch and English that said, "Speak softly, God hears all." After buying sufficient bread for the next days, we could begin to talk. It was the spirit of the times, he replied. If someone told you Bangladesh might be the next Cuba, would you not want to play a part? I admire Peter's experience of direct action, but I do not envy the burden of almost victory or the ghosts of murdered comrades. Over the last decade of tracing paths of failed revolutions from Asia to Europe, I've been thinking about why failure always insists on a prepackaged moral. We are meant to understand it could never work. Remember what happened last time? This far and no further. Please stop while you still can. Don't make us be sorry again. That is one reason I spend time with survivors who believe the cause was just, even if the methods were flawed, and the opponent so much more well-armed, cunning, and ruthless. I cannot inhabit their bodies, but I want to breathe in their dreams. The simple and powerful belief that revolution was just around the corner, and all it needed was a little push. Che Guevara's dead body did not intimidate Peter Custers. Rather, it inspired him to try again, in another country, another Bolivia. Che was not yet on a t-shirt, but very much on everyone's mind. These then are the people I follow, inhabiting a very fragile and flailing masculinity, people who have been leading movements in Bangladesh and elsewhere, always believing in crossing borders, no matter what mistakes might result. They have this in common. They believe that it's worth trying out mistakes, even in the face of a philosopher's 13 essays, which seem to suggest that if you're not of that country, you shouldn't even get involved, that you don't know enough. In particular, you don't know the language. I prefer this kind of person. That is why my films have been about these kinds of individuals instead. The best way to think of them is they are survivors as witnesses, slightly broken, still smiling, talking about the what-if moment of the last century, insisting they need to work on the next moment, very invested in reaching out to young people. What is important is that they talk about their hopes, but they also talk about their mistakes. And somewhere together is a sort of history I'm interested in writing, something that goes very much against the state's idea of correct history, but isn't too idealistic and hopeful either. Because I think recognizing the mistakes is the first step towards building another kind of solidarity. So in Two Meetings and a Funeral, which is upstairs, the part that I was most interested in is not necessarily the dialogue that's going on, that is talking about the moment that Castro gets up, or the moment that Arafat walks on stage and gives his speech, looking very much like a young Ringo Starr. The moment that I'm interested in is when a Singaporean man gets up, Singapore again, and says, we are criticizing and attacking the North, but it is their technology we are using. It's their cameras, it's their equipment. And whenever something goes wrong, we have to call in one of their technicians. Singapore was not a star of that non-aligned movement summit. They spoke on the last day. It was a lower energy day. And when the camera pans the audience, you can see that people's headphones are off. You see figures like Arafat and Gaddafi and they're not listening. And you also know, or you can generally presume, that they didn't understand enough English to understand what the man was saying. So the assumption was that we're leading the world revolution. This is, at least in that point, very much a Arab-focused movement, and oil money is a key part of even arming decolonization movements. They presume Singapore has nothing to say, especially not an Indian man from Singapore who doesn't fit with the idea of Singapore anyway. I'm very interested in understanding why people have their headphones off. That's the other history of those archival footage. And I invite all of us to work together to find those moments when people missed their great opportunity, so we might try to do it differently next time. Thank you.